Hey there! Thank you for tuning into Duckbricks, and welcome to another episode of Bionicle Fanon Reviews, where I review all the fan-created, canonized Bionicle models. These are not official sets, but instead have been officially accepted into Bionicle canon, either via LEGO contests like the 2005 Dark Hunter and Rahi contest, or the more modern, ongoing TTV canonization contest, which recently canonized models like Helrix and Artaka. Today's subject is a Dark Hunter from the 2005 contest named Tyrant. So Tyrant's backstory is that he is a member of the Shadowed One species. He lived peacefully on his island until Ancient incited a civil war, which caused many different members of the species to have to learn how to fight and squabble for land to survive. As a result of this battle, Tyrant became the ruler of his own little section of the Matoran universe, and was very well known for coming up with new and creative ways on how to execute people. Noticing his penchant for violent misdeeds and destruction, the Shadowed One recruited Tyrant into his organization. However, Tyrant spent most of his time as part of the Dark Hunters continually trying to challenge the Shadowed One's rule. I think that he felt that since they were literally the same species, came from the same beginnings, then he probably could have a shot at ruling over all the Dark Hunters. The Shadowed One did not like this, and as such, he basically ordered the rest of the Dark Hunters to betray Tyrant. He sent Tyrant out on a mission to battle with Toa Mangai Lekon and the rest of Lekon's Toa team in Metru Nui, and Tyrant was believing that he would be accompanied and backed up by 6 or 7 other Dark Hunters. However, all these Dark Hunters had the order to immediately disappear and leave Tyrant on his own the moment the Toa forces show up, so Tyrant was very easily defeated, barely managed to escape with his life, and the last we saw of him was vowing revenge on the Shadowed One from beneath the waves of the Silver Sea. We don't know whether he's dead or alive. There's no evidence to suggest that he's dead, so maybe he's still out there plotting his revenge against the Shadowed One, but that was the last we saw of him in the storyline. But story aside, let me just get into the main points in which I'll be reviewing this model. The first one is going to be posability, so can I get this into good poses without it falling over? Can it support the weight of its own weapons? And generally, are there any stability issues? Number 2 is building techniques, so does this just recycle existing things from these sets, or does it actually try to do something new? And was I impressed with any of the building techniques used for any part of this model? Number 3 is overall aesthetics, so story aside, does this look like a menacing character? Would I want to cross this guy in a fight? And how good do I think the general color blocking and color scheme of this model is? And finally, number 4 is just believability in universe, so compared against other Dark Hunters, other Toa, and especially for this case, compared against the Shadowed One because they're supposed to be the same species, does this look like it's part of the same subgroup? Does it make sense in the Bionicle G1 universe? And in general, is this believable as a Dark Hunter and character in the G1 world? But so without further ado, let's set all that aside and just dive right in to take a look at Tyrant, the Dark Hunter. Alright, so here is the Dark Hunter Tyrant. You can see that he is approximately the size of a standard Toa Inika build, but has quite a lot of unique things going for him, such as a completely custom-made torso and even custom-made feet. Let's start things off with posability first. So starting off with the legs here, you can see that it basically just has the standard amount of articulation. You've got your knees here and the tips of the feet, except the feet actually are a little bit different. To give him a more animal-like appearance, you've got this angled foot. It's very angular and actually uses the combination of the Mata foot piece with the Pohatu foot extension to great effect, which you can see that it's actually featured at an angle here. As such, though, unfortunately, sometimes it makes it so that he falls backwards, especially because the back of this foot can tend to make him want to fall backwards in combination with the large tail on his back there. You gotta really kind of angle him forwards to make him stand up straight. But once you have him standing, it's honestly not that big of a deal. The problem is not as big of a problem as you may think it is, because this is a pretty sturdy build. And if you're careful with it, he is not going to be falling over very easily anytime soon. Moving on to the back here, you can see that he has a fully articulatable tail, many linkages in this tail here. It's of course very simple, just using these standard upper leg pieces in segments as well as the Toa Metru lower arm pieces here, but it has its good range of articulation. You can really get it curved up, swinging back and forth, and obviously the tip of the tail is a very simple Hordika chest armor with the pincer piece at the end here, but it does its job fairly well, and if you really want to pose it up, you can almost make it look like a scorpion-like tail behind him. In this configuration right here, you can actually see how it almost goes above his head like so. So moving on to the arms here and the rest of the build, you'll notice that unfortunately there is one downside to the way this is built. The arms actually have a pretty limited range of articulation. Because it uses the Rakshi shoulder piece right here, you can't really bend this arm back and forth all too much. No matter what angle you do it at, you're basically just fixed to this being the furthest back you can make it, and this being the furthest forward. There's not very much in between that can be done here. Moving on from that, you'll notice that even though you have this pretty limited upper arm, you have the first hand here. Of course, he doesn't actually have elbows. This is all just one hand, but it can bend at a pretty fixed angle, which isn't actually a huge problem to me because of how cohesive this looks as an actual hand with claws. You can really see how this looks like a natural extension, and unlike some other models which don't feature elbows and really feel like they're missing it, I feel like if this included elbows, it almost would have not been as good because it would have made the arms just way too long. As such, I think the articulation in the arms is honestly just about right. Do I wish he could have moved the upper arm back and forth a little bit more? For sure. But I think the lower arm, and specifically the hand being just one large piece, honestly doesn't bother me too much, because it's pretty well built, albeit very simply. Of course, he is asymmetrical. On one hand, he has a blaster mounted, which is actually a full-on Technic competition cannon. It's a spring-loaded shooter right there. You can see it launches off, so a very powerful cannon he's got. And if you look closely, he actually has a full-on tracking sight. There is a transparent red stud underneath his cannon right here, which presumably has a laser that allows him to really accurately aim and target things, and looks really cool in action. You can see you can get him in some really fantastic poses if he's launching the cannon off like this. Moving on to the head itself, there actually are a few interesting things you can do with it. You can see here that immediately his jaw can actually open and close, so you've got not just the moving back and forth and up and down motion, but you've actually got this whole jaw opening feature, which is pretty unique, makes him look like he can actually have his mouth largely open. Of course, just using the standard Technic kind of connector piece here isn't really all too great for the lower jaw, but I think if you kind of have it fully closed or just open like this and leave it like that, it does look pretty good. And again, differentiates him from some other characters in the Bionicle universe, namely other characters that use the Rakshi head, because it really does feel like this is just the upper jaw to something a lot bigger. And I do like the large underbite that he has, making him have a very distinct appearance. Moving on though from posability, let's take a look at some of the building techniques here. One thing that I was pretty impressed with is the full-on custom torso build. This is not just using stuff that we've seen before in sets, it's really just coming up with something completely new, and for a build that was restricted to just the pieces of its time, I would say it turned out pretty well. You can see here that they combined a vertically placed Rakshi spine as the front torso here, which works really great, alongside some Borak rib cages, which do flesh well with the Rakshi spine right here, and even using the upper Rakshi shoulder mount in a way that's completely different than the actual Rakshi sets. Moving this around the back, you can see that all of this is built around two simple Technic beams, but you've got a fine amount of detailing and color striping on the back of the torso, and even an additional Rakshi foot as an armor piece making up the back side here. Of course, the tail is pretty simple, and I'm not honestly too impressed with the tail. It also feels like the tail is a little bit too long for me for someone of this size. And honestly, I probably could have been fine if they removed one or even two of the linkages to just make the tail a little bit shorter. But as it is, the tail's pretty simple, torso's pretty good, and I do actually like the custom technique used for the feet here because it does make the feet seem very distinct, especially when compared to many other builds. Mounting the foot at an angle here and then causing the Pohatu extension piece to really make this feel like one continuous element was a really smart move, and one that I really appreciate about this model, having a very ingenious build like so. Moving upwards to the arms themselves, again, unfortunate how the Rakshi shoulder piece kind of limits articulation here, but as far as the building techniques themselves, I actually really like the way that the arms are built, and it feels like these are natural extensions of his hands, especially with the blaster here. Again, if he had elbows, I really do feel like they would have felt like it was too long, so the builder definitely struck the right balance in terms of making this just overall have good proportions all around. And of course, moving on to the head itself, I think that the inclusion of the dolly hooks here do make it look like a unique mouth and a unique build. It does sometimes feel a little bit awkwardly placed, especially with this just smooth Technic beam right through the middle here, but all in all, I'd say the head is pretty decent. And especially if you look at it from the side view here, you can really make it look like he's talking or his mouth is chomping shut. So I do like the design use on here to make it look like these are just large teeth sticking forwards from the bottom of his mouth. And then finally, we can talk about overall aesthetics for this model. Despite being about the size of a standard Toa, I'd say this guy feels pretty threatening and definitely feels like a menacing opponent, at least compared to many of the other denizens of the Bionicle universe. The decision to make him have this arm-mounted cannon is fantastic for posing, and you really can get this into very interesting and dynamic poses with just this one very simple blaster. With him being positioned like it's firing off, you really can feel the weight of this gun and the impact that this blaster has, which is really cool, especially because this blaster was only used in Bionicle in one other way, which was with the Exo Toa. So this really does feel like he's packing a very powerful punch here and wielding a weapon that's almost a little bit too large for him, especially in scale with the other Bionicle launchers. All in all, I'd say the aesthetics on this one are very tight, especially even considering the color scheme overall. It's a very tight color scheme with the red, dark red, silver, and black. You've got a very cohesive look and feel here, while making this look like it really belongs together. And especially because a lot of the Dark Hunters suffer from color scheme and overall proportional aspects, this one nailing it definitely puts it several notches higher in my book. And with that, we can probably zoom out and take a look at this model and how it compares against other representative samples from the Bionicle universe. So I want to kick things off here with a specific comparison between Tyrant and the Shadowed One, because again, they are supposed to be members of the same species. The Shadowed One's very long third leg or tail definitely makes sense because Tyrant's is also quite long for his size, but honestly to me, that's kinda where the similarities end. Sure, I guess if you squint and really try to look at it, you could say that the large two teeth on Tyrant are very similar to the silver-shaped protrusions near the bottom of the Shadowed One's mouth, but honestly, it's a little bit of a stretch, and I can only really see these two being members of the same species because they technically have 3 legs / 2 legs and a very long tail. Beyond that, though, that's kinda where the similarities end. Alright, so zooming out here we have the Dark Hunter Tyrant alongside some representative samples from the Bionicle universe. First off, we have a standard Toa Metru-sized hero. This is Toa Lee Khan, who of course famously defeated him at the end of the Toa Dark Hunter War, as well as just a standard Matoran of Metru Nui for scale. So immediately you can see that Tyrant isn't much larger than the standard Toa. They're approximately the same height, which I think works out fairly well. He makes sense as a denizen of the Matoran universe, and if you ignore the large tail behind him and his more animalistic head, he could almost pass as something strangely Toa-sized. All in all, I think these scale comparisons here do make a lot of sense to me. But in terms of believability in universe, even just ignoring these size comparisons, I think this also works out fairly well. It's not just the scale, but it's also the fact that this uses very recognizable aspects of Bionicles, such as I mentioned before, the Rakshi foot in the back. You've got a lot of very nice limbs and fully armored up limbs for the back tail here. And really the only specialized thing about him is the very special bull-like feet, which also give him a slightly animal look and feel while still sticking within the realm of believability for a Bionicle. Even his head here is pretty great because it combines several different pieces with the standard Rakshi head, which does even just make me feel like this very much fits in the universe. And so, I'm going to give believability in universe a 9 out of 10. If only because maybe the blaster feels a little bit out of place, at least in the era that he came out in, but there would be more blasters like this later on in the future, so I can kind of excuse it. Even beyond that though, everything else is pretty much perfect, so this is very believable in universe. Moving on though, we can take a look at the other 3 points of this review. Starting off with general aesthetics, I actually really like the way this looks. How one arm is a targeting, seeking, and rocket launching arm on the side here, and the other is a vicious claw, really does make him feel like he's using a variety of different weapons, and this is a solid enough model to play around with, where if you get him in different poses, the aesthetics look good at pretty much every angle, because he's fully armored up. The only complaint that I do have is that in relation to the rest of his body, the tail does feel really, really long to me. Maybe if they just removed one linkage, it probably would have been fine, but with 3 different linkages here for the standard upper leg piece and the 3 different separate middle limb pieces, it starts to feel a little bit excessive to me personally. That being said though, everything else about it is generally pretty good. And I'll also say that as long as you have the tail curled up, it doesn't look too bad, and almost could be used as some sort of a stinger tail above his back here just because of how long it is in relation to the rest of his body. And so I think that with all of these factored in, as well as the fact that his legs really do give him a unique look and feel with the animal vibe, and the head even allows you to open and close his jaw, this is getting an 8 out of 10 from me in terms of overall aesthetics. And then we can move on to building techniques. And this, again, was something I was pretty impressed by. If you look at the entire model, the only thing that actually is quote-unquote reused from official sets are maybe arguably the upper and lower halves of the limbs here, and maybe some bits of the tail, but besides that, basically everything else about this model is completely unique to it, which is something I really like. And not only is it completely unique, but it's using pieces in clever ways, like a foot piece as the back armor, using the top Rockshi piece at a different angle than it normally is used, and even the Bolrock rib cages to make up the sides of his body. The torso, again, as I mentioned during the review, is one of the most impressive things about this model, and that definitely was, despite its simplicity, due to excellent usage of parts for the building techniques. And then where the feet are concerned, really the only complaint I have is that sometimes he can tend to fall backwards because these are very angled backwards like so, but they're honestly not too bad. And they definitely do work well as feet and reuse the Mata foot pieces at a completely different angle, making them feel like completely different appendages and really mixing up the way these parts work together in the Bionicle system. And all in all, I think I'm going to give building techniques an 8 out of 10 here. It's a fairly simple build and model, nothing too crazy going on, but that definitely doesn't mean it's bad. If anything, its simplicity is its strength, because it really knows where to use different pieces for good color blocking and for good effect. And finally, the last thing I want to note about this is posability. And as you can see, there are barely any issues with it. Now, the one big complaint I have with posability is the way that the upper arms are mounted. You see, the use of the Toa Hordika legs here really make it so you can't move his arm forwards all too much unless you really splay it out and then go forwards, and even then, you don't have a lot of range of articulation, as I mentioned in the actual review. The other thing is that he doesn't actually have elbows per se, because his hands are just mounted on these 90-degree angled joints. So you basically just have a fixed rotation to move his hands around, and you can't actually move these claws separately from his actual hands. That being said, it doesn't really bother me as much as it does for some other models, because they really do feel like natural extensions of his arms, and especially with this blaster, I wouldn't have wanted an extra limb joint, because at that point it would have felt like the limbs were too long. So I think it strikes a decent enough balance, and that's why I'm giving posability a 7 out of 10 for this model. Overall, despite his simplicity, Tyrant is one of my favorite Dark Hunters, just because of how cohesive the final model looks and how fun it is to pose around and get in all sorts of dynamic positions once you've actually built the final model. But that about sums up the review of Tyrant the Dark Hunter. Let me know down in the comments below, what do you think of this model? If you've built it yourself, how has your experience been with it? And as always, thank you so much for tuning into Duckbricks. Stay tuned every Monday, where unless otherwise stated, I'll be posting a new Bionicle Fanon review. Thanks all for tuning in, I'll talk to you again very soon, and bye bye for now.